Nobody expected this to happen. The Great Depression is arguably one of the most devastating events to occur in human history, and yet nobody saw it coming. Millions were out of employment, industries had shut down, banks were collapsing, things were getting out of hand, and the situation just kept getting worse. Now imagine the ripple effect of such a massive event on everyday life. There were families struggling to make ends meet, businesses shuttering their doors, and communities grappling with unprecedented challenges. The Great Depression was one of the longest and most severe depressions ever experienced in the Western world. October 24th, 1929 was the day history changed forever. On that day, a staggering 12.9 million shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange. But the panic didn't end there. Just 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday struck, another massive wave of panic selling, and this resulted in around 16 million shares being traded. Overnight, millions of shares became worthless, and those who had bought stocks on borrowed money or on margin were completely wiped out. And this started a domino effect with awful consequences. It was a sign that people had lost confidence in their economy. As the news spread of the crash, people just stopped spending money and stopped investing. I mean, this was really understandable human behavior. However, a cut on spending meant that factories and businesses were forced to cut back their production, and ultimately that meant that workers were being laid off. For those who managed to keep their jobs, wages had dropped and their purchasing power had dwindled. So even those who were earning money didn't really spend any money, and this massively impacted the economy. Now look, it's important to understand here that this wasn't just a financial crisis. It was the start of a severe economic depression. The collapse in consumer spending and lower investments impacted every part of the economy, and this led to widespread unemployment and suffering. And because of the size and influence of the US economy, what started off as a local crisis quickly became global. The gold standard played a pretty big role in helping spread these economic troubles, especially to Europe. The system tied various countries together with fixed currency exchange rates, and so when the US economy tanked, the shockwaves were felt worldwide. When you have falling stock prices, failing businesses, and a very fragile banking system, you end up with a scenario where everyone runs to the bank to pull out their money. The idea is to keep their money out of the banks and save at home. Again, a very understandable human behavior, but horrendous for the economy. Investors had lost faith in the solvency of their banks, and they rushed to withdraw their deposits in cash. This forced banks to liquidate loans and sell assets to gather enough cash reserves. Lending was cut as banks tried to shore up their reserves in an era of mass uncertainty. The fate of the world's economic system was unraveling. Now, while all of this was happening, some say that the US Federal Reserve's response worsened the situation. They believe that the feds allowed or even caused significant declines in the American money supply to maintain the gold standard. The flip side of that argument is that if the Federal Reserve had actually expanded the money supply during the banking panics, it might have caused foreigners to doubt the US's commitment to the gold standard, potentially leading to large gold outflows and forcing the US to devalue its currency. Similarly, if the Federal Reserve hadn't tightened the money supply in the fall of 1931, a speculative attack on the dollar could have forced the US to abandon the gold standard, just as Great Britain had already done. Now, in any case, let's get back to the impact of the Great Depression. The devastation was now in full swing, but it ended up impacting countries differently. Unlike the US, Great Britain was slower to fall into a period of negative growth and suffered less. Even at its peak, the decline of the British industrial production was only about 1/3 of what the United States experienced. Looking at France, they initially fared better. They had a relatively short downturn in the early 1930s with a brief recovery in 1932 and 1933. However, this recovery was short-lived as the French industrial production and prices again fell significantly between 1933 and 1936. Now, the biggest victim of the Great Depression was arguably Germany. It had been dependent on the US loans for its reparation payments, so when the US suffered a financial crisis, so did Germany. It had also suffered a similar rate of industrial decline, but the government wasn't able to fix it. Given Germany's recent history with hyperinflation in the early 1920s, their authorities were likely cautious about adopting expansionary policies out of fear of reigniting inflation. But what's more interesting than that is that in the less industrialized world, they actually fared better during the Great Depression. Argentina and Brazil, for example, didn't suffer as severely. Japan also faced a mild depression which began relatively late and ended relatively early. Their decline in production remained pretty mild compared to more developed nations. Now, across the world in British India, the level of impact of the Great Depression varied. With demand for goods falling, peasants and craftsmen suffered poverty. However, the landowners, urban workers, and government officials benefited. Their income remained the same or slightly less. However, their purchasing power actually increased due to falling prices, which allowed them to build their wealth. You see, the Great Depression could have been much less severe if the British administration had reduced their revenue demands. But, what do you think happened? Of course they didn't reduce their demands. Government salaries weren't lowered, and land rent continued to be high. Now, in contrast, there was one major country that actually experienced tremendous growth during this period, and that was the USSR. The Roaring Twenties had been a relatively wonderful decade for the West, but it was terrible for Russia. But ironically, the 30s was quite the opposite. Unlike other countries, the Soviet Union's command economy shielded it from international economic shocks. This system allowed the Soviet Union to experience rapid economic growth and significant industrial transformation even during a time when other economies were stagnating. But don't get me wrong, it didn't mean that their citizens were having a great time. The average worker never really benefited from this growth in Russia. On the contrary, wages were significantly reduced so that more funds could be diverted into mega projects. An average worker's wage in 1933 was a mere 1/10 of what it had been in the mid-20s. The USSR was flourishing, but the average workers, not so much. Okay, we talked about how the Great Depression impacted economies around the world. However, its impact wasn't just economic. It extended to all aspects of society, and it had a pretty big impact on women. During the crisis, women's percentage of total employment actually rose rapidly. In the US, for instance, from 1930 to 1940, the number of employed women rose by 24%, from 10.5 million to 13 million. Now, this can be attributed to multiple factors, but there were two main ones. One was the economic necessity, and the other factor was the rise in percentage of single women in society. In terms of economic necessity, what happened was that the financial pressures of the Great Depression drove even more women to seek employment because their male counterparts, the male breadwinners, lost their jobs, or the men weren't simply earning enough to run an entire household. And in terms of more single women in society, what happened was that marriage rates had plummeted as young people simply could not afford to start families. This resulted in more single women needing to support themselves financially. Now, with that being said, most jobs given to women were low-paying and service-related jobs. These included fields such as nursing, teaching, and domestic work. You see, the service sector had remained relatively secure even during the economic crisis. Now, these roles were less lucrative, they didn't pay as much. However, they provided crucial safety nets for many families to survive the crisis. Now, we talked about the impact of the Great Depression on countries and on women, but let's get back to the US for a second. Something very peculiar was happening in the US around this time. They were almost going against their usual political philosophies to tackle the impacts of the Great Depression. You see, the US had historically been against giving the government too much centralized power. The thought was that it could potentially harm individual liberty, but they decided that more intervention was needed during the Great Depression. And the reason was very simple: sheer psychological trauma from the Great Depression. Many say that no decade in the 20th century was more terrifying for people throughout the world than the 1930s. By the early 1930s, as much as 1/4 of the labor force in industrialized countries were unable to find any kind of work. And those who did find work, many found jobs that were underpaying or that paid just enough to make ends meet. It wasn't great for the economy. Long bread lines, street peddlers, shuttered factories, widespread rural poverty. This was the new norm. Many families were now homeless and they sought refuge in makeshift shelters cobbled together with salvaged wood, cardboard, and tin. Many teenagers left their families to become drifters, hopping freight trains in search of work or simply to escape their dire circumstances. Many marriages were postponed, engagements dragged on indefinitely, birth rates declined, and children grew up very quickly, taking on adult responsibilities of comforting their parents who felt hopeless. And this feeling of hopelessness served as fuel for social unrest. This was evident not only in the West but also in Asia. Conflicts were quick to ignite, and totalitarian elements took advantage of this mass suffering to seize power. All of this added together added a layer of human suffering to this era. Now, while the human cost of the Great Depression was devastating, there's another side to this story. You see, the Great Depression also happened to be a period that led to the transition into a fully modern economy. Among such shifts was the end of the international gold standard. You see, the Depression would really expedite this change. The Bretton Woods system that would eventually come a decade later after World War II did try to introduce fixed currency exchange rates based on gold. However, it never enjoyed the same level of commitment that this gold standard had. In addition, the Great Depression also paved the way for the expansion of labor unions and welfare states during the 1930s. This would give rise to stronger and more politically active middle-class society members. For instance, in the United States, union membership more than doubled between 1930 and 1940. It also saw the establishment of unemployment compensation and old age and survivors insurance through the Social Security Act of 1935, which was a direct response to the hardships of that era. In Europe, similar trends were observed. Many countries had seen increases in union membership and had established government pensions before the 1930s. But these developments accelerated during the Great Depression. All in all, it would pave the way for a robust, more politically active middle class. Wage cuts, which had been the norm in the early years of the crisis, made way for steady wage rises and employees becoming more organized. Government involvement had also quickly extended to regulations at this point, because people were now highly conscious about avoiding any kind of financial instability that contributed to the Great Depression. As a result of the Great Depression, major economists of the time were now being taken more seriously, and they ended up influencing a lot of the economic policies at that time. The most prominent example of this is John Maynard Keynes. His influential work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money of 1936, Keynes suggested that government intervention through increased spending, tax cuts, and monetary expansion could counteract economic downturns. Now, this theory laid the foundation for more activist economic policies aimed at stabilizing employment and the economy. In some way, this line of thinking still remains true to this day. Whenever a crisis happens, we see the governments trying to stimulate their economy by increasing their spending. Now, whether this is ultimately a sound or terrible economic policies remains hotly debated to this day. Now, while all of this is happening, there's another side to this story, which is actually quite interesting and, dare I say, quite hopeful. You see, after the Great Depression, we can observe a large number of cultural movements that came as a result. The bleakness and despair was being reflected in the art of the time. The 20s idealism paved the way for realism as people accepted their new reality. Journalism grew in popularity as a result. Traditional fiction seemed inadequate to describe the disastrous effects that the Great Depression had on everyone. You see, in response, many writers and artists turned to journalism and photography and creating eyewitness portraits of the desolate factories, shanty towns, and the struggles of migrant workers and tenant farmers. These visuals and narrative accounts aimed to capture the feel and essence of the era. Many governments, too, were encouraging this new movement. In the US, President Roosevelt strongly supported the idea that writers and artists should delve into the details of the American life to reflect and preserve the nation's experiences. As part of the New Deal, President Roosevelt's government launched many cultural initiatives, and it was strongly believed that just like construction and factory workers, artists and writers needed to sustain themselves and contribute to society. Now, this was a pretty big change in the way of thinking back then. Popular culture in the 1930s also saw a pretty big shift. Unlike the extravagant roaring 20s, this decade focused on simplicity and thrift. People mended their clothes rather than buying new ones, and the invention of synthetic fibers led to practical, easy-care fabrics. You see, the optimism and ambition of the 1920s gave way to a more mature and realistic outlook on life. It was an era of limits. You had to learn how to make the best of what you had instead of chasing unattainable dreams. Now, this was a time of truly massive change in society, in culture, and in the arts. And it also impacted the world's geopolitical order through migration. The old powers of Europe gave way to new ones to its east and west. Economic turmoil and rising political tensions led to wealthy or skilled Europeans fleeing to the United States, where their prospects were still slightly better. You see, in particular, it was Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933 which led to this mass exodus. With his oppressive policies and aggressive expansion, many of Europe's brightest minds were forced to seek safety elsewhere. Many first fled to France, but then after it was conquered, their final destination was the United States. This migration was instrumental in transforming New York City and Hollywood into new cultural capitals, surpassing Paris and Vienna. Simultaneously, Washington, D.C. also began to emerge as a new center of Western politics and diplomacy, replacing London and Berlin. And with this migration also came the flight of Europe's gold reserves. Between 1933 and 1937, the American money supply had increased by nearly 42%, largely driven by a substantial inflow of gold from Europe. This vast influx of gold and talent supercharged the United States. It finally allowed them to lower interest rates and make credit more accessible. This led to more spending and created expectations of inflation. Soon, sales of such items such as cars, trucks, and machinery increased, and factories were once again bustling. Moreover, the Great Depression was also an era that spurred the United States out of its self-imposed isolation. In response to the growing influence of Germany and Italy, the Roosevelt administration initiated cultural diplomacy efforts in what it considered its backyard, the Latin American countries. Establishing libraries, educational exchanges, and American schools marked the beginning of a more extensive strategy to export American culture as a tool of foreign diplomacy during World War II and the Cold War. Through this, the government had hoped to establish the US as a cultural leader globally, promoting American values and influence abroad. I mean, we see remnants of this in a much more twisted way today, for sure. Now, moving east, another power continued to rise, the Soviet Union. Now, we discussed earlier how unimpacted they were by the Great Depression. The Soviet Union's economy continued to grow in size, and they were not blind to their apparent success, particularly writers and intellectuals in the area. These people, through their works, gave a further boost to the prestige of the so-called socialist experiment. Once an international pariah, now the Union was enjoying a considerable amount of influence abroad. That's why you see a lot of great philosophers and writers from that area. The USSR's rapid industrialization and growth, managed by the state, became a model to be emulated at that time by many. This allowed it to exert its political influence to the likes of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the following decades. Now, while writing the script for this video and doing the research, I thought I would conclude with a very profound question. Could the Great Depression happen again? But now I think a better question to ask is the Great Depression already repeating itself today? I mean, sure, the stock market is up, profits are high, and the world economy is growing. However, when we compare the social symptoms of the Great Depression and how things are today, I can't help but find some striking parallels. More people are choosing not to marry and have kids. There's a rise in homelessness. Many highly educated people with jobs are unable to make ends meet. Even in developed economies, a large chunk of new jobs are low paying and service related, just like in the old times. Rural poverty has intensified, and desperate people are migrating great distances for a better economic future. And we're seeing a huge change in culture and arts, where information and news is consumed through media and entertainment, something that was unthinkable just a few years ago. Now, if you think about it, society is becoming divided into two worlds. There's one group where people are experiencing a sustained decline in living standards and frustration, and then there's another group reaching new levels of opulence and wealth. So back to my earlier question, is the Great Depression repeating itself today? The answer is probably not. Well, not exactly. At least we're not there yet, but that's why it's important to reflect on what happened on that October morning of 1929. Investigating the signs of what led to the Depression and learning about its devastating impact will hopefully teach us how to think about our futures a bit better. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.